The Preferences section, located under Edit, Preferences, contains various settings that will allow you to create a more efficient workflow in Shortcuts a Lot 2. Let me show you what each one of these does. First, let's take a look at the General tab. The first thing we'll notice is the SVG DPI dropdown. If you have an SVG file that was created in Illustrator or Inkscape, as you can see in the dropdown here, you'll want to select the corresponding program so that when you import those SVG files, they open up at the size that they were created in. So for example, if you create something in Illustrator at a specific size and have it set for 90 DPI for Inkscape, when you open it, it may be bigger or smaller than it was when you originally saved it. Now this may or may not matter to you, but if you want to make sure that the width and height that your file is created in Illustrator or Inkscape is the same in Shortcuts a Lot, you want to make sure that you have the correct program selected here. The next option is Remember Last Mat Size. Checking this box tells Shortcuts a Lot that you want it to remember the last mat size that you used before you quit the program. So let's say you were using a 12 by 12. When you reopen the program the next time, it will remember that. That way you don't have to go and select it from the Properties menu. The next option is the Use Full Font Scan option. If for some reason you're noticing that some of the fonts that you've added into your fonts folder is not showing up in your font list in Shortcuts a Lot 2, you'll want to make sure that this box is checked. I would suggest always having this box checked. The next option is Disable QuickTime for importing images. Leaving this option unchecked basically increases the variety of graphics files that you can use in the Auto or Image Trace feature in Shortcuts a Lot 2. If you want Shortcuts a Lot to be able to auto-trace native QuickTime files, such as a TIFF file, you'll want to make sure that you also have QuickTime installed. Next in the list here, you'll see the User SCAL Library section. And basically what this allows you to do is specify the directory that contains your library files. Now by default, the library is located under Documents and Settings, All Users, Documents, CraftEdge, and then Library. You have the option of specifying your own folder that will contain your library files. You don't have to change the directory, but you have the option to do it if you'd like to. And then below that is the User Artwork section where you can choose the directory that contains all of your SVG files. We have an entire video dedicated to this and how to use it with the personal library function of Shortcuts a Lot 2, so go ahead and check that out if you want to learn more about that. Now down here on the bottom left, you'll notice a Restore Defaults button. Okay, and what that does, when you click on it, it will take and just restore all of the default settings in every single one of these tabs. Okay, now under the Updates tab, you'll notice that there's a checkbox here that allows you to automatically check for updates for Shortcuts a Lot 2, and you also have a button that will allow you to do it immediately. Now with this button checked, every time Shortcuts a Lot launches, it'll go ahead and send a signal back home to find out if there are any updates available. If there are, you'll get a dialog box that lets you know that you can visit the CraftEdge website to download the latest version. Alright, so let's take a look at the Edit menu. Alright, now the first option you'll see here is the Constrain Angle Value. Now let me show you exactly what this does. First, I'm going to change this value to 15 degrees, and then I'm going to click OK. I'm going to take and add an element to my mat. Okay, I'm going to resize it. And now you can rotate this freehand like this by just clicking and dragging. Okay, but what the Constrain Angle option does is if you hold down Shift before you go ahead and rotate, watch what happens. It rotates in 15-degree increments. Now what we can do is we can go back to Edit and go under Preferences, go to Edit, and let's change this to 30 degrees and click OK. Now watch what happens. If we hold down Shift while we rotate, now it rotates in 30-degree increments. Now let me do it again. I'll go to Edit, Preferences, under Edit, and let's change this to 45 degrees and click OK. Click, hold down Shift, and now watch. Now we've got it in 45-degree increments. There you go. Okay, so that's a really handy tool actually. Okay, so back under Preferences, we'll go under Edit. Here you have the nudge increment value and the arrow key increment value. Okay, now the arrow keys are basically the arrow keys on your keyboard. And this value basically tells Shortcuts a lot how far to move each element based on a click of the arrow key or a click of the nudge key. So watch, I'll show you here. I'm going to set this to 1 inch, okay? And I'm going to click OK. I'm going to place my heart on the mat. And now if I click on nudge, look at that, okay? It's moving it 1 inch. Okay, let me place this on the 1 inch mark so you can see. It moves over to the 2, to the 3, to the 4. Okay, now I'm going to click on the arrows on my keyboard. Okay, look at that. See how it's moving 1 inch in every direction. Now I'm going to go back to Edit and go to Preferences under Edit, and I'm going to change this to, let's see, let's go 2 inches now, just so I can show you that it's actually doing what I'm telling it to. Okay, so now I'm going to click, and now I'm going to nudge, and now it's moving 2 inches. Same thing with the arrows, 2 inches in every direction. Okay, so the next item on the list is keep proportions as default. Okay, now what this does, and I'll show you exactly what it does. I'm going to go ahead and check this box and click OK. Now I'm going to go ahead and add an element to my mat. Now I'm going to click on the resize handle here on the bottom right. Okay, now when I do this, no matter which direction I size it to, it's going to make sure that the heart stays in proportion. Okay, so now let me show you the alternative. I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, back to Edit, and I'm going to uncheck Keep Proportions as Default and click OK. Now I'm going to add another heart to the mat. And now notice that when I drag this, I can drag it so I can make it skinnier or wider and fatter, and it's not keeping the proportion. Okay, now as an alternative, if you highlight this and you click this button here, Keep Proportions, it will keep it in proportions. Okay, this option under Preferences just makes sure that everything that you place on your mat will automatically have this checkbox selected. Okay, so now watch again. Right now, if I import another heart, you'll notice that Keep Proportions is not automatically checked, okay? And right over here, you'll see that. Now, if I go back to Edit, Preferences, Edit, Keep Proportions as Default, and click OK, I'm going to add another heart. Now watch, there it is. It's automatically checked, okay? So you can resize it. It'll make sure that it doesn't get skewed in any way. Now also, as an alternative, you can go in here, Preferences, we can remove this option, click OK. Now if we import another heart, if you hold down the Shift key while you resize it, that will also make sure that it's in proportion. Okay, but at any time, if you let go of the Shift key while you're resizing it, watch, you can actually move it around however you want. Now I'm going to go back and hold down Shift, and there it is, back in proportion. Okay. Now this is very important, especially when you're dealing with SVG files and you want to make sure that they cut out the way that they were designed after you resize them. Let's go back to Edit and Preferences. And that's really it for the Edit section. Now if we go under Cutter, the first thing you'll notice is the cut speed, okay? This is where you can select how fast or slow your cutting machine will cut, okay? Okay, there's maximum, high, medium, low, and then minimum. Now the speed that you use is going to vary depending on how intricate your cut is. If you have a very, very intricate cut with small details, you're probably going to want to cut at a low to minimum speed. That way you reduce tearing. If you have some very, very simple shapes and your mat is nice and sticky and your blade is nice and clean, you can feel free to bump it up to medium, high, or even maximum if you feel comfortable doing that. We always find that we get the best results when we cut at a low to minimum speed. Okay, now the next option you'll see here is Keep Mat Visible when cutting. Now this does exactly as it says. When you go ahead and begin cutting an element, usually what will happen is your mat will disappear and a little box will come up letting you know that there's a cut in progress. Now if you have this checked, you'll also be able to have the mat in the background. Now this is just a personal preference, it's completely up to you. Now next on the list is Remember Cricut Model and Firmware. Okay, now this will save you some time if you have this checked, The first time you go to cut something, it's going to come up and ask you to select the Cricut model, whether it be an Expression or a Personal or whichever model it might be, as well as the firmware. Now, once you have that in place, if you've only got one cutting machine, you don't need to keep putting that information or selecting that information every time you cut. So you can go in here and check this box to remember your model and firmware. That way you won't have to keep telling Sure Cuts a Lot, yes, this is the model and this is the firmware. It saves an extra step. Okay, and finally we have the Warnings tab here. And the first item you see here is Warn Me About the Firmware Version. Now this is basically a dialog box that will come up every time you cut to ensure that you have the correct firmware on your cutting machine. Okay, so it's a good idea to leave that unchecked once you have everything up and running. The last item you see here is the Warn Me About Too Many Fonts Installed. Now we'd all love to have thousands and thousands of fonts installed on our machine, but that's only going to create problems for the computer, not just Sure Cuts a Lot. Programs that use fonts, such as Sure Cuts a Lot 2 or Microsoft Word and even Photoshop, may start taking a little bit longer to load if you start putting too many fonts in your fonts folder in Windows. A couple hundred's okay, but you don't want to start adding thousands of fonts. You'll never end up using that many fonts, and it's going to be a real pain to try to navigate through all of those fonts. So keep it under a couple hundred if you can. And finally, on the bottom left, you'll notice the Restore Defaults button. If you happen to click on something and you're unsure and something's not working right, or if you just want to take these settings and set them back to how they were when you originally installed the software, you can do that in a click of a button.